Now, on the 20th century.
I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Mad bombers.
Holy cow. About a third of the building has been blown away.
They operate anonymously, they strike at random, and they leave death and destruction in their wake.
I can't imagine who would do something just that terrible.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. Bombings by assorted madmen have been a part of the fabric of American life since the 19th century. And in the years leading up to the Second World War came major advances in bomb-making technology. Bombs became not only deadlier, but easier to build. Much of that technology became not exactly common knowledge, but not all that difficult to obtain. Take the case of George Metesky, dubbed the Mad Bomber, who terrorized New York in the 1950s.
A 16-year hunt for New York's Mad Bomber ends with the arrest and confession of George Metesky, a toolmaker.
It was 1957, 17 years after he planted his first bomb, that New Yorkers got their first look at the man called the Mad Bomber as he was taken to court for his arraignment.
You don't know what will happen now, I suppose.
Well, I can hope for the best at the moment.
Yeah.
George Metesky began his reign of terror in 1940 when he planted his first bomb, a lead pipe stuffed with gunpowder, on the window ledge of a local power company plant in Midtown Manhattan. Less than a year later, he planted a second device. Both bombs were discovered before they exploded. At the end of 1941, America entered World War II, and Metesky put his bombing career on hold.
He was such a patriot. He didn't want to cause any disruption in our country. He's such a great guy, George Metesky. So he waited. He waited till the war was over, and then it's like Jaws 2, you know, I'm back.
It was 1951 when he planted his next bomb. Unlike his first two, this one exploded in Grand Central Station. No injuries.
What made it really scary is that the targets were not specific. No one in the city knows where he will strike next.
Over the next 5 years, Metesky planted a total of 31 bombs, from a phone booth in the headquarters of Consolidated Edison to department stores and subways in Manhattan to a movie theater in Brooklyn. 22 of them went off, injuring 15 people. Police knew that all the bombs were planted by the same person because, for one thing, all the devices were wrapped in wool socks. And that was just one of the bomber's trademarks.
The subject would write communiques, and basically directing the communiques initially at Con Edison and later on to newspapers, but basically threatening and challenging everyone.
From the letters and postcards, it was clear that the Mad Bomber had a grudge against Consolidated Edison, New York's utility company. But Con Edison's files were an amalgam of several different power companies that had been consolidated into one utility. As a result, they were voluminous and disorganized. The police were overwhelmed with the prospect of going through all of them.
We're talking about a time when law enforcement really wasn't very, very sophisticated in investigations, nor were they sophisticated as yet in the area of forensics. So he really was in a good position to get away with his crimes.
Almost in desperation, the police department decided to try something unorthodox in their effort to solve the crimes. They asked psychiatrist James Brussel to look over the evidence to see if he could come up with something.
He began describing this person as a loner. His appearance would be very, very orderly, very, very neat. And the reason he's saying that because he was briefed on how the bombs were put together, and he could see the handwriting. And he told him that his nationality, and he said that when you would arrest this person, he would be wearing, in all probability, a double-breasted suit. And he said, oh, by the way, it'll be buttoned.
Dr. Brussel suggested that the police publicize his profile in order to get the Mad Bomber to write more letters that might give more clues to his identity. And sure enough, Metesky sent 2 letters to the New York Journal-American in early '57. The newspaper printed both of them, and they contained just enough detail to break the case.
The first clue this company had of where to look came in a letter published in the New York newspaper last week.
In that letter, the Mad Bomber mentioned a specific date, September 5, 1931. At last, the Con Ed staff had a place to start looking through their files.
Among the 60,000 compensation cases filed at the Consolidated Edison Company was the key file that held the clue to the whereabouts and identification of the Mad Bomber suspect. Miss Kelly, how long had this...
Alice Kelly, who worked in Con Ed's insurance claims department, found the vital piece of evidence in the file of former employee George Metesky.
And on top of the file, there was a letter. When I read the letter, I saw that there were words in it that was in the newspaper the following day, or the previous day.
Words like dastardly acts.
And then I read on further, and, well, it wasn't a good letter.
Metesky's letter said he was injured in an accident on September 5, 1931.
He was working in the Hellgate station, and in walking through the boiler room, he said, there was a flash from one of the boilers, and he inhaled some of the boiler gases. And as a result of that, he feels that that was the cause of his getting tuberculosis.
The company immediately alerted the police department about George Metesky.
They said they would take care of it and gave them the address of the last known address that we had on our file of this man.
Where was that?
That was in Waterbury, Connecticut.
4 detectives from New York went up to Waterbury, Connecticut. With the aid and cooperation of Waterbury police, they searched the home of a suspect there, found the lathe and other materials which made them almost certain they had the right man.
Sir, your birthday, November 2nd, 1903.
What's more, according to police, he fit psychiatrist Brussels' profile. Polite, neat, clean-shaven, a middle-aged white male of Slavic background, a fastidious but not a flashy dresser. In fact, when the police brought Metesky back to New York, he was wearing a double-breasted suit, just as Dr. Brussel had predicted. It was also buttoned. James Brussel had invented a new investigative tool.
It was the first time a profile had ever been done, and that's the most significant part of it.
The case of George Metesky never went to trial. The Mad Bomber was judged insane, and he was committed to a mental hospital. In 1973, he was sent home, and in 1994, he died at the age of 90. But while George Metesky never built or planted another bomb, others took his place. Organized activists who used bombs to advance their own political agenda. That story when the 20th century returns. As the United States became polarized by the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the nation's college campuses were filled with protest groups, none more active than the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. After years of nonviolent protests, about 400 SDS members became dissatisfied with the results. So in 1969, they formed a more radical organization called the Weathermen, dedicated to nothing less than violent revolution. They exploded on the national scene in Chicago on the night of October 8, 1969.
The loudest voices of the student movement now belong to the way out fringe, the so-called crazies who advocate revolution now and violence for violence sake, which is the way things turned out. The SDS Weatherman faction calls this week's marches and protests against the Vietnam War and racism Days of Rage.
The Weathermen had marched out of Lincoln Park apparently looking for a confrontation.
And at a major intersection, the SDSers got their wish.
Last night was a beginning for us. We have gone on the offensive.
They remembered the year before, which was a Democratic convention in which there were massive riots in Chicago.
Bill Dyson was in charge of the FBI's investigation of the Weathermen.
Their feeling was that if they could cause riots in the United States, that the troops in Vietnam would have to be called home by the president in order to put down these riots. In actuality, it didn't work.
Approximately 400 protesters had shown up for the Weathermen's Days of Rage, and by the fourth day, about 300 of them had been arrested. The remaining Weathermen left Chicago, only to come up with a new plan to cause a revolution a few months later.
They made the decision to create a clandestine organization. They were going to take their strongest individuals and put them underground. They would do legitimate things like perhaps work jobs, live like in a family style, yet on the other hand would be doing clandestine activities such as casing buildings, perhaps doing robberies to raise money, and of course doing terrorist acts.
But one of their first terrorist acts misfired when a Greenwich Village townhouse was destroyed in a huge explosion in 1970 in which 3 people were killed.
When the home of wealthy advertising and radio executive James Platt Wilkerson was torn by explosion and fire last Friday, authorities first assumed an accidental detonation in a gas line had been responsible, except that the blast had been just too powerful.
Firemen picking through the rubble discovered clues about what had really happened.
They found a basement workshop with sticks of dynamite and the materials needed to make bombs, also the literature of SDS and the radical left. Wilkerson's 25-year-old daughter, Catherine, who was seen after the explosion but who then vanished, had been active in the Weatherman faction of SDS.
Police said Catherine Wilkerson and her fellow weathermen had turned her father's townhouse into a bomb factory.
Police say they found 60 sticks of dynamite, 30 blasting caps, and assorted wires and pipes in the basement wreckage.
Remains of the 3 victims were also found.
2 of them were apparently working on bombs in the lower level. The other one appeared to be on a second level above where the bombs were being worked on. He may have been sleeping at the time. The 2 who were actually working with the bombs, their bodies were devastated. It took a long time to identify who they were.
By the time the authorities had pieced together enough evidence to convince them it was a bomb factory, the survivors had gone underground.
I think what happened really was that those who were weaker left the organization in fear. The strong ones stayed and said, this happened, we're sorry it happened, it killed 3 of our members, but we're going to continue on.
Hello, this is Bernadine Dorn. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war.
In May of 1970, one of the leaders of what was now called the Weather Underground distributed a tape recording warning of the group's plans.
Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
And 14 days later, the Weather Underground made good on its threat. A series of explosions ripped through the 2nd floor of the New York City Police Department, injuring 7 people.
Mayor John Lindsay called the bombing dastardly and said such acts cannot be tolerated, but he did not say how they can be prevented.
These individuals were people who acted for political purposes only, and therefore they respond differently than a normal criminal. And it took law enforcement a few years to figure out exactly how to deal with these individuals.
Last night we destroyed the pig again.
Over the following 6 years, the Weather Underground claimed credit for more than 30 bombings at the State Department, at Harvard University, even at the Pentagon and the U.S. Capitol.
Well, the implication was very clear. We blew it up at night, but we could have blown up during the day. We could have killed congressmen or senators or visitors. We could have done that. That was a real threat.
What's worse, authorities were having a hard time tracking them down.
Nobody knew where they were, and it's very difficult to try to put an informant in a group if you can't find them.
In the end, law enforcement had nothing to do with the disappearance of the Weather Underground.
The most popular thing they had was the war in Vietnam. They were tying everything into this. Well, as the war is drawing down, they're losing their cause.
While a few members joined up with other revolutionary groups, most of the Weather Underground fugitives turned up over time.
Many of them very secretly just sort of came up and started using their name again. Others of them very openly and had press conferences and so forth and announced that they had surfaced.
Bernadine Dorn emerged from hiding in 1980 after 11 years as a fugitive, still defiant.
Given the system which perpetuates such harsh oppression and suffering, rebellion is inevitable and continuous, and I remain committed to the struggle ahead.
Like most members of the Weather Underground who reappeared, Bernadine Dorn was given probation for her role in the Weathermen's Days of Rage back in 1969.
We never were able to get enough evidence to indict anybody for the specific bombings. So they did horrible acts, but we don't know who the they were.
As the Weather Underground was winding down, another small group of political activists surfaced, this one demanding independence for Puerto Rico. Calling themselves the FALN, they launched a new bombing campaign against the United States. In 1975, the FALN detonated a deadly bomb at historic Francis Tavern, one of New York's oldest restaurants. Firefighters arrived within minutes of the blast.
We had a good blast, no fire. We had people all over the place. We removed them all. We must have about 8 to 10 people removed from the scene.
This device was placed in the entranceway to the Francis Tavern building to go off at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon when they knew that the restaurant was packed with people. There was no way that that device could have exploded at that time and not kill people.
4 people were killed and more than 50 were injured in the bombing. The FALN took credit for the attack, but authorities had no idea who they were.
Obviously, we're starting off behind the 8 ball. We've got bombings taking place from a brand new group, and we have no idea who's even in the group.
By the fall of 1975, the FALN had expanded their targets to other American cities.
At about 2 a.m. Eastern Time today, bombs began exploding in New York, Washington, and Chicago. There were 10 separate explosions within 45 minutes.
It was obvious they were trying to show law enforcement that they were able to conduct a coordinated attack, and it certainly got our attention.
2 years later, the FALN took credit for another series of bombs in New York, which claimed another victim.
All the casualties were suffered at the Mobil Oil Building when a bomb exploded in a first-floor travel office.
Only one person was killed, but it was a miracle. The place was so crowded with people that that one poor man was practically up against the device. And as a result, he got the whole force of the blast.
As the number of FALN bombings mounted, more than 60 by 1978, authorities got a lucky break.
There was a terrible explosion in New York. And when law enforcement arrived at the scene, they discovered it was a bomb factory, and they discovered a seriously injured individual who was identified as William Guillermo Morales. Both of his hands were blown off. Part of his face was blown off. He lost part of his jaw and so forth. Severely injured, yet not cooperative.
Morales was the first member of the FALN to be taken into custody. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to 89 years in prison.
They bring him to the Bellevue Hospital for fitting with artificial hands or to do something in order to enable him to better function in the prison. He manages to escape.
Even though Morales got away, clues at his bomb factory helped the FBI identify other members of the FALN.
We now know who the people are. We've got Carlos Torres as a top 10 fugitive, so at least we knew who we're aiming at, and we're developing more and more intelligence.
But it would be another 2 years before the FBI arrested another FALN terrorist. On April 4th, 1980, in Evanston, Illinois, a quiet, well-to-do suburb of Chicago, a local resident noticed several suspicious people jogging up to a parked van and climbing into the back.
Something strange about what they were doing this for. And it wasn't natural.
Mrs. Jacobson called Evanston police, who just nabbed 2 suspected gang members in a stolen van, and who found 9 others waiting in another van, along with handguns and rifles, but no explosives.
In total, the Evanston police arrested 11 Hispanic men and women who refused to talk. The Evanston police called in the FBI.
I walk in and they're saying, we've got these strange people, can you help us to identify them? And I'm going, wow, well, I know him, I know him, and I know him, and I'm able to identify these individuals, including Carlos Torres. Now, there were some individuals I didn't know who they were, but it was obvious as soon as I made one identification that I knew that this was the FALN.
The FBI's investigation led to more arrests around the country.
They also had safe houses in New Jersey and New York. And the investigation just led from one place to another place to another place. And it looked like we had crippled the FALN.
But just 2 years after the Evanston arrests, in March of 1982, the FALN exploded another 4 bombs around Wall Street in New York. And 10 months after that, they struck again. This time as thousands of people jammed Times Square for New Year's Eve.
3 miles from the celebration, a string of explosions rocked government buildings, shattering windows and seriously injuring 3 policemen. Shortly before the last explosion, this phone call came into New York radio station WCBS.
Yes, night editor, please.
Speaking.
Yes, listen carefully. This is the FALN. We're responsible for the bombings in New York City today. Free Puerto Rico, free all political prisoners and prisoners of war.
But in 1983, the FBI infiltrated the FALN, and for the first time, they thwarted the bombers' next attack.
4 alleged FALN members were arrested yesterday after what a lawman called the most successful penetration and infiltration of a terrorist group ever in this country.
The arrests were the result of a 3-year investigation by the newly created Chicago Terrorism Task Force.
We had cameras. We could watch them do what they were doing.
The FBI's Dyson headed up the group.
There is a very sophisticated, methodical, careful, and covert investigation of these individuals. They had no idea they were under investigation.
In the end, 15 FALN terrorists were found guilty on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder, and they were sentenced to terms of 30 years to life. In 1999, President Clinton granted clemency to 11 convicted FALN members who agreed to renounce violence. None of them had been tied to any specific bombing, but the clemency offer was a disappointment to many law enforcement officials because it had taken them so long to track down the FALN.
Today, law enforcement is so well organized. We know how to investigate terrorism with such expertise that the fact of the matter is incidences like occurred in 1969 and during the 1970s by groups like the Weathermen, the FALN, they would be solved very quickly today.
The FBI also said that bombers who act alone remain the toughest cases to crack because lone bombers go to great pains to conceal their identities. In fact, 2 of the nation's deadliest bombers pretended to be members of radical organizations just to throw the authorities off the track. Their stories when the 20th century returns. By the late 1980s, advances in technology helped bombers become more sophisticated. For example, they perfected triggering devices that went off only after a package was opened. In fact, federal judge Robert Vance was killed by just such a bomb in late 1989.
Security is tight around the house where Judge Robert Vance was killed. A package he received in the mail exploded. Dozens of FBI agents, firearms investigators, postal inspectors are trying to figure out who wanted to kill Judge Vance and why.
The judge's workload, caseload, is being scrutinized by us.
2 days later, a security guard found an unexploded bomb in a package at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, the court where Judge Vance had served.
A bomb expert holding the package with the explosive device slowly walked out of the court building, placing the small brown box in a disposal unit on an evacuated downtown Atlanta street.
That same day in Savannah, Georgia, prominent African-American civil rights lawyer Robert Robinson was killed when he opened a 3rd parcel bomb in his office.
It exploded, spraying nails, blowing out windows, sending debris into the street.
The very next day, Willie Dennis, branch president of the NAACP headquarters in Jacksonville, Florida, received a suspicious package in her office. Previously warned about the mail bombs, Dennis told her secretary to call the police. It turned out to be another bomb.
It was wrapped like the others, shaped like the others. They were powerful, full of nails, and exploded immediately when opened.
Investigators studied the unexploded bombs to try to learn more about the bomber.
Looking at the bombs, the person would have to have a degree of intelligence, have to be above average in intelligence. But it also tells you, too, that by making these devices with that inclined to be so obsessive, compulsive, and dedicated and mission-oriented, that he has a lot of anger harboring within himself. So he's very specific on these targets.
It arrived here at Eyewitness News last night.
On December 28th, 2 weeks after the bombings, an Atlanta TV station received a letter from a hate group claiming responsibility for the mail bombs. But some FBI investigators did not believe that a hate group was responsible.
He was trying to throw a curve to law enforcement to get him off of and away from him.
The meticulous construction of the bombs was so distinctive that it reminded a local investigator of a similar bomb used in a crime committed 18 years earlier by a man named Walter Leroy Moody.
This is the bomb that led authorities to Walter Leroy Moody. It was sent to the Federal Appeals Court in Atlanta last December, and the gunpowder, nails, and pipe found in the unexploded bomb were strikingly similar to a bomb that Moody made in 1972.
Arrested for the bombings, Moody was found guilty of murder.
He had tried for years to get the courts to overturn his old bomb possession conviction, but when federal judges denied him, he struck back with a vengeance. Prosecutors called Moody a genius, but before jurors, he stumbled and rambled, said he was framed, the Ku Klux Klan did it all, that he wasn't working on bombs in his house, he was working on nuclear fusion. The jury didn't buy it.
Moody was sentenced to serve 7 life terms plus 400 years in prison.
He falls into more of a revenge, retaliation type of an offender. He's very specific.
And because his targets were so specific, he was relatively easy to track down. Not so with a killer who came to be known as the Unabomber, whose deadly bombing career spanned 17 years.
The problem with the Unabomber is that if you don't identify him quick enough or soon enough, someone particularly who wants to put the fear of God in a lot of people, is that they'll get better and better in what they do.
The Unabomber first struck at Northwestern University in 1978 when a mail bomb exploded, injuring 1 man. Less than a year later, the second bomb was placed aboard an airliner.
The FBI says an American Airlines 727 with 80 persons aboard landed safely today at Washington's Dulles International Airport after a small bomb exploded in a mail pouch in the cargo hold. American Flight 444 en route from Chicago landed without injury to any of the passengers or crew.
It was a very unusual kind of bomb because of its construction, because of the handiwork, and probably most of all because every component was handmade. There were no purchased electrical components, something that is very unusual.
On June 10th, 1980, 7 months after the bomb exploded on the American Airlines plane, a bomb seriously injured the president of United Airlines, Percy Wood, at his home in suburban Chicago.
He said that he was opening a small package of some sort that looked like a book, and that the bomb exploded from within that package.
It was obvious that the same person built that bomb that put the bomb on the airplane. So we had a serial case right there.
Because the unknown bomber had attacked both universities and airlines, the FBI named the case Unabomber. The criminal they were looking for became known as the Unabomber.
What made it difficult for law enforcement is that what is the motive? What kind of a motive do we have here? The person in this case is not communicating with us, so it's really leaving law enforcement in dilemma. Is it the airlines or is it a university?
Between 1980 and 82, 3 more bombs were found at universities. The first in a classroom at the University of Salt Lake City in Utah. The second in the Computer Science Building at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And the third in the faculty lounge at the University of California in Berkeley. Berkeley professor Diogenes Angelakos was injured when he picked up what appeared to be a discarded gasoline can.
As I lifted up the handle, it exploded. Then it took all the flesh off the fingers and left just the bones in the upper part.
The Unabomber waited another 3 years before striking again. On May 15, 1985, in the same building at UC Berkeley, Air Force Captain John Hauser, a graduate student with hopes of becoming an astronaut, was severely injured when he picked up a loose-leaf notebook in the computer lab and opened it.
Zap! You know, it exploded, threw my hand over to the side. I could see my hand was really torn up very badly. Then I noticed that I had this big gash out of my arm and blood was starting to bubble up out of there and then squirt out.
I suddenly felt a strong pressure.
6 months later, another bomb sent to the home of a University of Michigan professor wounded a research assistant there. And then a month after that, on December 11, 1985, Hugh Scruton, the owner of a computer rental store in Sacramento, California, was killed by a bomb filled with nails, which had been planted in the store's parking lot.
It's just a tragedy, something like that happened. I can't imagine who would do something just that terrible.
By the time of Scruton's death, the FBI had enough information to piece together a rough profile of their assailant.
There was generally a feeling amongst the profilers and agreed upon by the investigators that he had some sort of grudge against technology in society.
That assumption grew stronger when, just over a year later, the Unabomber targeted another computer store, this one in Salt Lake City. It was bomb number 12, but this time the Unabomber had been seen planting it.
Federal agents have released this composite drawing, the first time witnesses may have spotted a serial bomber who's allegedly killed one person and injured 21 others.
The composite sketch did not produce a viable suspect, but it did drive the Unabomber underground.
Certainly he was crafty enough to know, I better lay low for a while.
The Unabomber laid low for a full 6 years. And then in June of 1993, he sent 2 bombs through the mail from Sacramento, California. One to a genetics researcher at the University of California in San Francisco, and a second 2 days later to a computer expert at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, name of David Galerntner.
It's gory and grotesque, but a man who's been blown up by a bomb is a mess.
Within hours of the Yale bombing, the New York Times received a letter written by an anarchist group called FC, claiming responsibility for the 2 bombings. But the FBI remained convinced they were not looking for a group, but rather a lone bomber.
He's a serial killer is what he was, trying to put the fear of God into us.
Nothing more was heard from the Unabomber for a year and a half, until December 10th, 1994, when a powerful mail bomb exploded in a suburban home in North Caldwell, New Jersey, killing advertising executive Thomas Mosher. And 4 months after that, on April 24th, 1995, the Unabomber killed again.
The bomb, mailed to a timber industry association, was designed to kill, and it did. Gilbert Murray is the 3rd person to die in a Unabomber attack.
Within days of that attack, the Unabomber mailed 2 more letters, one to the New York Times and another to one of his victims, Dr. David Galerntner, the Yale computer expert.
Says people with advanced degrees aren't as smart as they think they are.
Then 2 months later, the Unabomber sent what he called a manifesto to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The FBI and the Justice Department convinced the 2 papers to publish it.
The bomber calls his manifesto Industrial Society and Its Future, and in it he urges a revolution against what he calls the industrial system. The FBI said today it hopes someone will see the article and recognize the author.
And that is exactly what happened. David Kaczynski and his wife Linda read the Unabomber's published manifesto word by word with what they said was growing anxiety. They compared it to letters they'd received from David's older brother, Ted, over the years.
Take the common phrase, they want to have their cake and eat it too. Only the Unabomber and Kaczynski would sometimes reverse the order and write, eat their cake and have it too.
Convinced that his brother Ted was the Unabomber, David Kaczynski got in touch with the FBI.
FBI agents entered Kaczynski's home 2 miles outside Lincoln, Montana today, armed only with a search warrant, looking specifically for manufacturing tools and a typewriter closely identified with the Unabomber's work.
Ted Kaczynski was led out of his isolated 1-room cabin and placed under arrest in April of 1996.
Kaczynski, seen here in a 1962 Harvard University yearbook, is a native of Chicago. He graduated from Harvard with a degree in mathematics and later was an acting assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California in Berkeley before quitting in 1969, saying he was tired of teaching.
The FBI said he moved to the hills of Montana and became a recluse with an IQ of 170 who apparently was concentrating solely on building bombs.
I didn't envision someone to be so disheveled in his appearance and his clothes falling off his body. He was very sloppy, very, very disorganized. However, the tools of the trade, the things that he deals with day in and day out, the tools that makes him, in fact, the Unabomber, those items and his diaries and digests, everything is in order, everything is very organized and rigid.
Inside the cabin, the FBI found the typewriter Ted Kaczynski had used to type his manifesto, his bomb-making materials, and his meticulous journals with records of his attacks. With that kind of evidence, the prosecutors were able to build a powerful case. But Ted Kaczynski's trial ended shortly after it began.
The Unabomber's career is over. Today, for the very first time, Mr. Kaczynski offered to plead to a sentence of life in prison with absolutely no strings attached.
No one knows how long it might have taken to find the Unabomber without the published manifesto that led David Kaczynski to recognize his brother's writing style. And authorities wondered why, after so many years underground, Ted Kaczynski had risked exposure by having his manifesto published. Some experts believe he wanted to regain the spotlight that had shifted to less sophisticated but much more destructive bombs in the 1990s. Those stories when the 20th century returns. The Unabomber targeted individuals, sending relatively small and increasingly lethal bombs through the mail. But in the early 1990s, less sophisticated bombers used rented trucks loaded with crude explosive materials and attacked huge buildings filled with thousands of people. They began in New York.
It was the noon hour here in New York City. The Twin Towers 110-story World Trade Center was crowded with workers. Without warning, a bomb exploded beneath the building in downtown Manhattan.
It's another smog. You can breathe. You can breathe.
Something blew. Something big blew.
The explosion blew an 18-foot hole in the basement, which holds an underground parking garage and the train station where several subway lines converge.
The ceiling of the train station collapsed. Some victims were apparently killed here.
6 people were killed in the explosion and more than 1,000 injured. Authorities said the death toll was remarkably low, considering the force of the blast.
All of us were just amazed at the devastation into 5 stories of the structure. Hundreds and hundreds of cars completely destroyed. Floors caved in and big girders cut through and slammed in through other parts of the building.
It was several days before it was safe enough for forensic investigators to work.
It was somewhere around 1,200, 1,500 pounds of homemade explosive, if you will, with a burning type fuse. So a very, very simple bomb, not sophisticated at all in the final analysis.
The big question was, who had set off the bomb? Investigators picking through the rubble finally found one small clue that broke the case.
The big break came when agents from Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms zeroed in on the charred and mangled pieces of a yellow Ford van that had every mark of having carried the lethal explosives. Federal agents traced the van to a Ryder car rental agency in Jersey City, where they say the suspect rented the vehicle in his own name the day before the bombing. After the bombing, the suspect reported the van stolen and returned to the lot 3 times to try and retrieve a deposit.
The FBI quickly rounded up their suspect, a 26-year-old Sudanese named Mohammed Salameh. Arrests of 3 other suspects followed, and a New York jury convicted the 4, all connected to an Islamic fundamentalist group, on March the 4th, 1994, 1 year and 6 days after the World Trade Center bombing.
This verdict should send a clear and unmistakable message that we will not tolerate terrorism in this country.
The government also said that the 4 bombers were loyal followers of Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, a blind Egyptian cleric who, along with several other Muslim extremists, was facing trial for an even bigger conspiracy.
The men are charged with plotting to bomb targets all over New York City, the United Nations, the FBI's New York office, as well as the Lincoln and Holland tunnels leading into New York from New Jersey, and other government and military facilities.
It would have dwarfed what had happened with the World Trade Center, and yet the New York Terrorist Task Force was able to penetrate that organization with an informant and technical coverage and so forth, and was able to prevent the acts.
The men were arrested in this Queens, New York building. The FBI had videotape surveillance here that is said to show the suspects in the process of constructing bombs of ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel oil, the same chemicals used in the World Trade Center bomb.
Also arrested was the leader of the Muslim sect, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman.
There is a
an organization that is a support system for terrorism in the United States. Its designer is the Sheikh.
The jury agreed with the prosecution's contention that Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, a blind Egyptian cleric, was the spiritual leader of a wide-ranging terrorist conspiracy.
The convictions of the terrorists did little to alleviate fears that fundamentalist bombers would strike again. So when a massive bomb exploded just a year later in Oklahoma City, Arab terrorists were immediately suspected.
Just after 9 o'clock Central Time in Oklahoma City, an explosive device, which is being described by officials as a car bomb, went off in front of the federal building in downtown Oklahoma, shearing the north face off of the 9-story building. Some 500 federal workers were believed to be inside at the time that the bomb went off.
The Oklahoma bombing at the federal building in Oklahoma City was very similar to the World Trade Center case, in that we had a large vehicular bomb driven up to or in the building with hundreds of pounds of explosive.
Many of the bomb victims were children who were in a daycare center located on the second floor of the building.
3-year-old Brandon Denny is one of the children from the center. He is in critical condition with a crushed skull.
This is America. We shouldn't have to run scared. We shouldn't have to worry about taking a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old to a daycare and kissing them goodbye.
The bomb had killed 168 people, 19 of them children. President Clinton vowed to find those responsible.
But make no mistake about it, this was an attack on the United States, our way of life, and everything we believe in. So whoever did it, we'll get to the bottom of it, and then we'll take the appropriate action.
The very same day, federal agents investigating the wreckage found a fragment from the bomber's truck, and on it, the crucial vehicle identification number, which led to a Ryder truck rental company 270 miles away in Junction City, Kansas. Clerks there described the men who had rented the truck.
The FBI today put out composite sketches of 2 suspects wanted in the case, and there's a $2 million price tag on their heads.
But the sketches revealed that the 2 most wanted men in America were not Arabs.
2 white males were associated with this vehicle. As a result, arrest warrants will be sought for these 2 males.
Ironically, one of the prime suspects in the bombing was already in custody.
I am pleased to announce that one of the individuals believed to be responsible for Wednesday's terrible attack on the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City has been arrested. Timothy McVeigh, age 27, who we previously called John Doe No. 1, was arrested by local authorities on a traffic violation.
Minutes after that announcement, the second suspect, now identified as Terry Nichols of Decker, Michigan, surrendered in Harrington, Kansas without a fight after coming under police surveillance.
In August of 1995, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were indicted on 11 charges, ranging from conspiracy to first-degree murder. But it was clear that authorities believed McVeigh was the mastermind behind the bombing.
McVeigh is specifically charged with having delivered the bomb to the Murrah building in a truck that he rented under a false name, and having detonated the bomb at the Murrah building.
After a 7-week-long trial, McVeigh was found guilty on all charges, and on June 13, 1997, a jury recommended that he be sentenced to death. At his sentencing, McVeigh showed no remorse.
McVeigh rose before Judge Richard Mach. Do you have a statement? Yes, Your Honor. What McVeigh said next appeared to be a reference to Waco, the motive of the bombing. It was a 1928 quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, a warning about government that breaks the law. McVeigh read, "Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example." Then McVeigh said, "That's all I have." The worst mass murderer in American history had nothing to say for himself. At the end of the 9-minute hearing, Judge Richard Mach looked at McVeigh. It is the judgment of the court that the defendant, Timothy James McVeigh, be sentenced to death.
McVeigh's co-defendant, Terry Nichols, was found guilty of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter. The jury apparently unsure of the extent of his involvement in the bombing. He was sentenced to life in prison. I'll have some final thoughts on the bombers when the 20th century concludes. In the past, building a bomb required some kind of special knowledge that was difficult to obtain, but that is no longer true.
I could hit the internet and somebody would tell me how to do it, how to build a bomb, how to get the bomb supplies, how to get a sophisticated weapon. The technology is available.
What's more, that technology is becoming more deadly.
And you don't need a huge device. I mean, the devices that you can set off today, even nuclear devices, are devices you can put in your suitcase.
So even though the police have become much more skillful at tracking down bombing suspects, even the most experienced law enforcement authorities will tell you that it's not a question of whether, but when another bomb will go off. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century.